My name is Julia Maddox. I'm 38 years old, and I outrank my father. But you wouldn't have known that from the way he looked at me that night. She's nothing like me. That's what he said, right into a live microphone, in front of a ballroom full of war heroes, retirees, military brass, and his old commander, General Evers. The air in the room didn't change immediately. That's the worst part. People just laughed politely as if it was a harmless joke, as if dismissing your daughter on stage was normal. I was sitting at table 17 far from the front, my uniform dress pressed my nameplate sharp, my lips frozen behind a sip of still water. He didn't even glance my way. The setting National War Legacy Banquet, Alexandria, Virginia. The occasion, honoring veterans and their families. The keynote speaker, retired Colonel Thomas Maddox, my father, and the humiliation fully mine. The question came from a woman at his table. I remember her voice, pleasant, curious, well-meaning. "Isn't that your daughter over there?" "Julia." That's when he chuckled, adjusted his cufflinks, then leaned into the mic and said it. "She's nothing like me. Not, that's my daughter. Not she serves too. Not even yes. Just a dismissal veiled as wit." The woman turned her head toward me. So did two others. One man looked embarrassed for me. Another smirked. My stomach turned cold like ice had replaced my lungs. My grip tightened on the glass. I didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't move. Because if I had, I would have gotten up and walked out, and I had earned the right to sit in that room, more than some of them ever had. Let me tell you something about that night. I didn't come for closure. I didn't come to make peace. I came because I'd been invited not by my father, but by the Defense Department itself. My presence wasn't ceremonial, it was strategic. The event was honoring legacy leadership across multiple eras. And though most didn't know it, I had just concluded oversight of Operation Widow Lift, a multinational evacuation and humanitarian logistics op that quietly saved over 3,000 lives in Sudan and western Yemen without firing a single bullet. I was the ghost in the machine, the architect no one thanked, until now. Across the room near the VIP cluster, General Evers stood by the flag display, stoic, still built like an Abrams tank in a suit. His gaze wasn't warm, but it was direct. He saw me, and then he started walking, straight toward my table. I kept my face composed, but my chest tightened. This man had once commanded my father during the Gulf War. A battlefield legend, a man whose name was spoken like a title long after retirement. My father revered him, idolized him. He hadn't noticed that Evers had left his circle, hadn't seen him moving across the carpet with measured, grounded steps like a missile with intent. I stood, not because I expected anything, but because I refused to meet history sitting down. He stopped in front of me, looked me over once, then down at my uniform. His eyes landed on my badge. Strategic Global Logistics Command. Field Marshal. He nodded once, slowly, then said, "It was you, wasn't it?" I met his gaze. "Yes, sir." He didn't ask for a brief. He already knew. Instead, General Evers turned his body just enough for the room to see him, and with clean precision he saluted me. The room didn't react at first, but I heard my father's voice stutter. Then someone dropped a fork, and slowly, one by one, chairs creaked. Heads turned, mouths hung open. Colonel Thomas Maddox was halfway through a sentence when he finally saw what was happening. His old commander was standing saluting his daughter, the daughter he said was nothing like him. He went quiet, and in that silence I returned the salute. Not with pride, not with ego, with truth. Because I had carried every mission, every chain of command, every insult, and every sleepless decision like a pack on my back for nearly 2 decades. And that salute wasn't for who I was, it was for what I'd become. Behind the general, a young lieutenant whispered, "Wait, Field Marshal." A ripple moved through the back row, but I wasn't listening anymore, because my father had stepped down from the podium, walked toward us, fast. He looked between us, eyes wide. "Evers," he said, You know Julia." The general turned to him slowly. "I report to Julia." Silence. And then he added with the weight of every word carrying years behind it, Field Marshal Maddox, ma'am. It's an honor. My father's face paled. My heart did not race. It stayed still, anchored. I'd waited years for this moment, and I was ready. Growing up, I used to believe there were two kinds of soldiers, the ones who kicked down doors and the ones who made sure the doors could be found in the first place. My father only respected the first kind. From the moment I could walk, my world was green fatigues, chow hall trays, sandbags, and polished boots by the door. Military housing, military schools, military rules. Even the family dog was named Sergeant. Dad was already a decorated officer by the time I turned 7. A battalion logistics chief turned combat commander. He served during Operation Desert Storm and always made it sound like his unit was the only one that ever mattered. His voice got louder when he talked about combat, quieter when Mom mentioned administration. It was clear, even then, paper pushers didn't earn salutes. I was a quiet kid, curious, organized. While my brother staged toy invasions with G.I. Joes, I drew up mission routes with highlighters and ruled lines. I memorized aircraft capacities for fun. I knew what MREs weighed and how long they lasted in storage. Dad used to laugh. "What you want to be quartermaster?" I'd nod. And he'd say, "You were supposed to aim higher, Jules." When I joined ROTC in college, he barely looked up from his coffee. "You sure?" he asked. "You don't seem like the type to handle combat." "I'm not," I told him honestly. "But I want to lead the people who make combat possible." He blinked, then said, "Sounds like paperwork with a title." Despite it all, I pushed through. I graduated top of my ROTC class at George Washington University and received my commission in logistics. I was deployed to Djibouti within 8 months and assigned to a joint coalition base where I had to coordinate shipments across 4 countries with 3 languages and only 1 stable internet connection. No one clapped. No one back home asked. Dad never called. I rose quietly. 6 years in, I oversaw logistics for multi-branch disaster relief after the Haiti earthquake, improvising airlifts after a fuel shortage, negotiating civilian aircraft leasing, without violating protocol, and re-establishing a base camp in 72 hours. By then, I was a lieutenant colonel. Dad didn't attend the ceremony. He mailed a card. It said, "Stay safe. At least you're not on the front lines." I burned it. I learned early to stop chasing his praise, and I learned to speak through results. Every mission I touched, every convoy, every base rebuild, every drone corridor ran like blood through arteries no one thanked. And I kept going. 10 years in, I was stationed at U.S. Central Command as the first woman to lead multinational logistics coordination for operations in Syria, Jordan, and Libya. They gave me a nickname, the Quartermaster Ghost, because no one saw me coming, but they all knew when I'd been there. When I became Field Marshal, my promotion wasn't even public. That rank is rarely acknowledged outside of internal command, a strategic necessity, not a parade item. Dad never even knew it happened. I didn't tell him. I didn't want to. He'd made it clear years ago unless I was holding a rifle or storming bunkers, I wasn't real military. He once introduced me at a family reunion as his daughter, kind of a commander, but not in combat. My cousins laughed. I smiled through it, then returned to my hotel and cleared 12 urgent comms from 3 continents. I always thought the ache would go away, that one day I'd stop hoping he'd see me not just as his daughter, but as someone who had carved out her own doctrine inside the military he worshipped. But it never left. It just buried itself deeper under every file, every deployment, every successful rescue op, until that night, until he said it into a microphone like a punchline. "She's nothing like me." He wasn't wrong. I am nothing like him. He commands with ego. I command with silence. He demanded obedience. I demanded accuracy. He left scars. I left maps. And now I sit at the same table as men like Evers, men who don't need shouting to recognize power, men who see a field marshal and don't ask if she fired a weapon, they ask how she moved an army without one. That's what makes what happened next so much more than just revenge. Because it wasn't about proving my father wrong. It was about stepping into a truth I'd always known and finally letting the world see it for themselves. The next morning, my name was trending on internal military comms forums. Not because I'd done anything new, but because someone had finally noticed what I'd already done. Someone had recorded the moment General Evers saluted me. The clip was short 15 seconds. No flashy background music, no dramatic camera angles. Just a steady hand, a crowded banquet, and one man's voice calling me Field Marshal Maddox in full view of my father. That was all it took. It went quietly viral inside the kinds of circles where rank and silence carry more weight than noise and followers. Quiet payback, I heard someone call it. Appropriate. My phone lit up with messages I hadn't asked for. Old instructors, colleagues, soldiers I hadn't seen in a decade. Ma'am, it was time. We saw it. You earned that moment for all of us who were invisible. But the message I was waiting for, the one I pretended I didn't need, never came. Not from my father. I flew back to D.C. that afternoon, work bag at my feet, mission files in my lap. The pilot of the C-40 nodded when I boarded, not out of courtesy but out of recognition. You can always tell the ones who know what you are, what it means to wear stars without needing ceremony. The cabin was quiet. I didn't sleep. Instead, I thought about the moment his eyes met mine. Not during the salute. After. That flicker of disbelief. Then recognition. Then shame. I wanted it to feel satisfying. It didn't. It felt like grief. A few weeks later, a formal invitation arrived, typed stiff like a summons in disguise. Colonel Thomas Maddox requests the presence of Field Marshal Julia Maddox at the Maddox Family Retirement Gathering. Location: Fort Carson Officers Club. Purpose: celebration of 35 years of service. No signature, no note, just expectation. I didn't RSVP, didn't send regrets, I showed up. The room smelled like cedar polish and veteran pride. Framed medals on every wall. A projector screen displaying a slow reel of my father's career from boot camp to full bird retirement. Faces of men now gone. Men he loved more than he ever loved anyone in our family. He stood in the center of it all, surrounded by guests and decades laughing like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't gutted his daughter with a joke. He saw me almost instantly. His face didn't change, but his shoulders did. Just the slightest drop. As if he knew this wasn't going to be the story he got to tell. I didn't walk to him. I waited. I stood by the windows near the flag display, a mirror of the moment he'd tried to erase me. Let him come to me this time. It didn't take long. Julia, he said, smoothing his cuffs. You made it. I did. I wasn't sure you would after the event. The one where your commander saluted me. A pause. Then, with that same casual coldness he'd perfected over the years, he caught me off guard. So did I, apparently. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "You've done well for yourself." Quietly. I let the silence hang. It always made him uncomfortable. "You outrank me now," he finally muttered, half a laugh, half a sneer. "That's not hard," I said, soft as breath. He looked at me then. Really looked. Not as his daughter. As something else. A threat, maybe. Or maybe just something he didn't know how to process. "You think I didn't support you because I didn't love you?" he said. "I think you didn't support me because I didn't serve the way you wanted me to. I didn't understand your path." "No, you refused to see it." He opened his mouth. Closed it. There it was again, that flicker. Recognition without resolution. The war he'd always waged wasn't with me. It was with the idea that someone could lead without echoing him, and I had become living proof. Before he could speak again, a young officer approached. Nervous, eager, freshly commissioned based on his insignia. "Ma'am," he said to me, ignoring my father completely. "Are you Field Marshal Maddox?" I nodded. He swallowed. "I studied your Sudan op in War Ops 402. Your reroute of Phase 3 changed the entire course of the extraction model." I smiled gently, not gloating. "Glad it helped." He shook my hand. Hard. Like he was meeting someone sacred. Then turned to my father. And saluted. "Sir, thank you for your service." Then walked away. My father's lips were tight. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, finally, "You don't need me anymore." I met his eyes. I never did. It wasn't cruelty. It was truth. And for once he didn't try to fight it. He just gave a slow nod and walked back into his story, while I stood in mine, unapologetic, unbroken, and finally beyond his reach. You'd think that moment watching him walk away, watching the weight of his own silence finally press on him, would feel like victory. But it didn't. It felt like the last page of a book I had spent my whole life begging him to read. And he never did. I left the retirement event early, didn't say goodbye, didn't make a speech, just nodded at the officers I knew, accepted a few stiff handshakes, and stepped out into the crisp Colorado air alone. No one followed, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't want them to. I didn't want applause or recognition or even another quiet salute. I just wanted stillness. But even that didn't last. Back in my hotel room, I took off the dress uniform carefully, methodically, the way I always do. Each piece folded like ritual. A second skin removed, the badge that bore my title Field Marshal set down gently on the desk. I stared at it for a long time. Not out of pride, out of exhaustion, because the truth is carrying power that no one wants you to have. It wears you down, even when you've earned it, even when you've worn it well. I poured a glass of water, sat on the edge of the bed, and let myself feel the thing I never let surface. Not rage, not vengeance, not even disappointment, but grief. Not just for the father who never saw me, but for the little girl who spent her entire life trying to become something he might finally respect, and for the woman who achieved more than he ever did yet still had to fight for the right to sit at the same table. I remembered being 10 years old, standing in the hallway with my first homemade salute. He had walked past me, didn't even glance. He was late for a flight or something, or maybe he just didn't think it mattered, but I had stood there for a full minute after the door shut, arm raised, waiting. I don't know what I was waiting for. Permission, maybe. Recognition. Something. I let my head fall into my hands now, because sometimes even after everything, even after the rank and the ribbons and the salutes, you still bleed in places no one sees. And in that hotel room for those few minutes, I let myself feel it. The ache of being invisible to someone whose gaze shaped your sense of self. Then a buzz on my phone. Not work. Personal. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Ma'am," a voice said on the other end. Young, nervous. "This is Cadet Foster. I hope it's okay." I reached out. "I got your contact from the SENTRY network." I sat up straighter. "Yes, Cadet," I said. "I just wanted to say thank you." I watched the clip, the one with General Evers, and I realized I've been serving like I'm apologizing for existing. Like logistics makes me less, but watching you, I finally saw someone who didn't flinch, who stood still, and I thought maybe I could do that too. My breath caught. I closed my eyes, because that's when it hit me. My father's recognition wasn't the prize. This was. The ripple effect, the shift, the cadet who might now walk into a command post and not feel like a ghost in boots. The next generation wouldn't have to wonder if they deserved to be there, because now they had proof. I thanked the cadet, gave her a contact at SENTRY, told her I expected to see her name in command one day. She laughed, awkward and breathless. "You will, ma'am." Then she hung up. I sat for a long time after that, not crying, not breaking, just returning to myself, like I had finally exhaled the version of me that was still waiting for him to say, "Well done." He never would, and that was okay, because someone else had, dozens had, and more would. I rose, put my badge back in its place, then picked up my laptop, because this time I wouldn't just stand in the room quietly. I would build the table and make damn sure no daughter ever had to ask permission to sit at it again. 3 weeks after I returned to D.C., I restructured SENTRY from the ground up. I didn't want it to be a mentorship network anymore. That was too small, too safe. I wanted it to become a command doctrine, a doctrine that would change how military leadership viewed logistics not as back-end service, but as strategic warfare in motion. And more than that, I wanted it to make room for the forgotten, the overlooked, the people like me who had spent their lives stepping around men who never saw them coming. The first move, I submitted a proposal to the Pentagon's Strategic Innovation Office. Title MAD Force, Military Advanced Deployment and Doctrine for Field-Oriented Resilient Command Execution. A mouthful, yes, but a necessary one. Inside was a blueprint not only for training, but for redefining the military power structure to acknowledge and promote those who lead without ego. I included case studies: Sudan, Haiti, Syria, disaster logistics, fuel grid reversals, international corridor stabilization, all led by invisible officers, all ignored in traditional award systems. And yes, I signed my name at the bottom field, Marshal Julia Maddox Command Authority level, Tier 7 clearance, Joint Strategic Log Ops Authority, call, sign veil. I didn't care if my father saw the proposal. I didn't care if anyone tried to block it, because it was time to stop fitting within legacy and start building the future I wish I'd walked into at 19. 2 days later, I received a direct message from General Evers. Read it, approved it, backed it. Full review session next quarter. You have the room. Use it. Short, sharp, unmistakable. He had handed me a command-level green light. I wasn't just speaking now. I was leading doctrine. I looped in Ray, the cadet I'd once mentored and who now led the East Coast SENTRY branch. We built a task force of 9 women and 5 men, all of whom had quietly changed mission outcomes and never once made a headline. They didn't care about recognition. They cared about impact. We ran simulations, created policy drafts, mocked up command templates for forward-deployed units to recognize logistics leadership before crisis. Then, we published the first white paper under the new name Quiet Doesn't Mean Absent Modern Warfare's Invisible Command. It circulated fast. Within 2 weeks, officers from CENTCOM, AFRICOM, and USENDAPACOM requested strategic consultation briefings. 3 generals wrote in response. This just filled the gap we've ignored for 30 years. And quietly, the SENTRY insignia began appearing on briefcases, training docks, and shoulder patches. Not official yet, but the signal was clear. The tide was turning. Then one day, something unexpected happened. I received a letter, handwritten, no return address. But the handwriting, I recognized it instantly. Julia, I watched the SENTRY interview, the one with the cadets. I listened to you say, we move mountains without medals. You're right. I was wrong. For a long time, I thought I knew what service meant. Turns out I just knew how it looked in mirrors. You didn't need my approval, but I wish I'd given it anyway. You earned everything. And then some dad. No Colonel Maddox. No rank. Just dad. I read it 3 times. Didn't cry. Didn't crumble. But for the first time, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel since I was a kid saluting an empty hallway. Release. A week later, I returned to Fort Carson not for him, but for a closed-door training seminar. They asked me to lead it. I walked through the same room where he once gave that retirement speech, past the photos, past the polished floors, past the men who used to look through me. And I stood at the front of that room and said, leadership isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who still shows up when no one else knows what to do. Logistics is not support. It is strategy. And I will not apologize for knowing how to move a nation in silence. When I finished, the youngest officer in the room stood up first. Then the rest followed. No applause. Just nods. Quiet, unified, and full of the kind of recognition I used to beg for in my father's eyes. I had stopped begging. Now I was defining the standard. 6 months later, I received the official invitation. United States Armed Forces Joint Doctrine Revision Board, Closed Session Hearing National Defense HQ, Subject Elevation of Strategic Logistics Command to Tier 1 Warfare Doctrine. It was happening. Everything we built, the white papers, the simulation models, the Mad Force proposal, the cadet programs, it had climbed its way into the uppermost rungs of military restructuring. They had asked me not just to present it. They asked me to command the review. Normally, I would have accepted without hesitation. But this time I paused, because I knew who would be there. Colonel Thomas Maddox was still on the Defense Leadership Advisory Council, a ceremonial post mostly. A formality. But it meant he would be seated at that long table staring down at me again. Not as a father, as a man who had spent 3 decades making me feel like I'd never worn my uniform correctly. This wasn't just another strategy meeting. This was the room, the one I'd spent my entire career fighting to enter on my own terms. I accepted, not because I wanted to prove anything to him anymore, but because there were 100 women watching me from behind the ones coming up next, and I would not leave that chair empty. The day of the hearing, the air inside the Pentagon briefing hall was sharp, cold, precise. Every seat was filled. Generals, analysts, command chiefs, field leaders, a few familiar faces, many skeptical ones. And at the far right end of the panel, my father, his face blank, still, chin high, but I could see the faint twitch in his left brow, the way his thumb moved slightly across the folder in front of him. He'd read the briefing packet. He knew exactly what I was proposing, and he knew who wrote every line. I stood at the center of the chamber, dressed not in full blues, but in my operations uniform, simple, clean, every patch earned. When I began to speak, I didn't clear my throat. I didn't pause for effect. I just said, "The next war will not be won by who shoots first. It will be won by who arrives with purpose, precision, and sustainability. We don't need louder voices. We need smarter corridors." For the next 45 minutes, I broke down the doctrine. I didn't read from notes. I commanded the room. I walked them through global infrastructure disruptions, evacuation failures, broken chains of command that cost time and lives because logistics had never been treated as leadership. I presented our simulations the real-time success metrics from SENTRY operations and the new promotion protocols we'd trialed across 6 bases with 0 failures. I ended with this: there is no such thing as just logistics. There is only mission failure, or mission follow-through, and we've followed through quietly, relentlessly without medals for long enough. When I stepped back, the room was silent, until a general on the left whispered, "She's right." Then another nodded, and then, from the right end of the table, a chair shifted. I looked up, and my father stood, slowly, deliberately. He closed his folder. Then he looked at me, and for the first time, not in uniform, not at home, not behind a mic, but face to face, he said, "I never understood your path, but I see it now, and I salute it." And then he did, right there in front of the joint board before 4 stars and analysts and commanders. Colonel Thomas Maddox raised his hand and saluted his daughter. I returned it just as steadily, not because I needed it, but because he did, because that salute wasn't for me. It was for the space between us that had finally collapsed under truth. After the session ended, as the room broke into clusters of murmurs and schedules and defense chatter, he walked over to me. No ceremony, no applause, just this Field Marshal Maddox. "You built what I never could." I nodded once. "Thank you, sir." He hesitated, then said softly, "Jules, you were never nothing. I just couldn't see you while trying to hold on to who I used to be." I didn't cry, but I did place a hand on his shoulder, then walked past him, toward the cadets waiting in the hallway, because they were next, and they were watching. I don't remember everything people said to me that day. I don't remember which generals nodded who asked for follow-ups, or even what coffee I drank afterward. But I remember one moment in perfect clarity. A young logistics lieutenant, maybe 24, stood waiting outside the hearing room with her cap in her hands, uniform crisp, hands trembling, eyes wide. When I stepped into the hallway, she stepped forward, then stopped short like I was made of something she wasn't allowed to touch. I smiled softly. "You have something to say, Lieutenant." She swallowed, then said I didn't think someone like us could command a room like that. My throat caught, but I kept my voice even. We always could. They just weren't ready to admit it. She looked down at the sentry pin on her uniform, quiet matte steel, barely noticeable to the untrained eye. Then she looked back up and said, "I will be now." That night, I walked alone through Arlington Cemetery. Not for mourning, for reflection. The stars above me were sharp and cloudless, the air full of quiet promise. I passed rows of names' legacies etched in granite. None of them knew who I was, and that was fine, because I hadn't built my story to be known. I had built it to last. A few weeks later, the Joint Chiefs passed the resolution MADD Force officially recognized as Tier 1 Strategic Doctrine. Logistics Command would now have embedded seats at mission planning briefings. Field-level logisticians would receive tactical authority in deployment corridors, and promotion tracks would begin, including operational impact over combat optics. It didn't make headlines, but inside the command infrastructure, everything changed, for the better. I received one more letter after that, not from my father, from General Evers, typed formal, folded in his signature eagle clasp seal. I have watched more men win medals for less than what you've moved in silence. You didn't just earn your seat. You built the table. I'm proud to have stood beside you when they first realized who you are. It ended with 4 words handwritten below the signature, "Keep going, Field Marshal." I framed that one, not to hang in my office, to keep on my desk, where the younger officers always see it during check-ins and SENTRY briefings. Today, there are 147 SENTRY chapters worldwide, across the US, Germany, Okinawa, Djibouti, Korea, and even NATO liaison desks in Brussels. Each week, someone sends me a short message that begins the same way, "Ma'am, I finally stopped apologizing." And I reply with the only truth that matters: good. Now, teach someone else. My father still calls sometimes, not often, not easily. But when he does, he says, "Julia." And sometimes when the silence hangs long enough, he says, "I'm proud of you." And I've learned not to wait for the perfect version of those words, because now I don't need them to stand tall. I am the legacy, not his, mine. I walk into rooms now with purpose, not to be seen, but to remind the quiet ones that they're not alone anymore, that they can lead, without shouting, without asking, without shrinking. At the last Defense Women's Leadership Summit, they asked me to give closing remarks. I didn't use a script. I stood in front of 300 officers, young, old, decorated, dismissed, and said, "My father once said I was nothing. He was wrong. I was logistics. I was movement. I was command without applause. I was the silence that outlasted the storm. And if you're here today, so are you." There was no thunderous standing ovation, just 300 officers quietly standing in respect, some with tears, some with fists curled to their hearts. And in that moment, I knew we had arrived.